Hi, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of the online version of Journalism 101, Critical Analysis of the Mass Media. I'm your course instructor, Dr. Paul J. Trout. This chapter is intended to begin to provide you with an introduction to the critical template that will be used the entire semester in most chapters. It's also designed to begin to get you thinking about becoming more critical and more analytical about the media that you consume. So one of the broader goals of this chapter is to create and generate media literacy on the part of all of you who are in this class. So even if you don't go forward in terms of a professional career in media, you will be better consumers, more critically inclined, and perhaps help other individuals within your social sphere, family members, children, or whatever, to become more media literate themselves. Of course, the professional component of what we do this semester and what we're doing as you move forward as undergraduates in our program is also intended to make you better producers of media content. And so hopefully this chapter will begin to get you thinking about what are some of the differences between media, and what does it mean to do television? What does it mean to do web design? What does it mean to be a journalist in today's multi-platform environment? And how do messages get changed depending on that platform? So let's move forward and talk a little bit about what are some of these components of media literacy that you'll be introduced to in this particular chapter, and that will be carried through the rest of the semester in additional chapters as well. So let's change the page here. The learning objectives, obviously, are to introduce you to and get you going on becoming more media literate. And media literacy is defined by your authors as the process of critically analyzing media content by considering its particular presentation, its underlying political or social messages, and ownership and regulation issues. There are 4 ideas within that definition, and if you can begin to get your arms around those ideas, you're going to become a more informed, more literate consumer and hopefully creator of media content. So let's go back in and look at this definition. The process of critically analyzing media content by considering its particular presentation. As we're going to see in the next panel, print media, as I suspect you already understand, at least at a rudimentary level, print media is vastly different from electronic media. Television's different from radio. Web design, in terms of presentation of text or streaming video or animation, is yet different still. All right? And so people who become aware of those different presentational needs and requirements become better communicators across multiple media. And that's one of the goals we have for you this semester. You also have to begin to understand that no content is created in a political or social void, particularly political void. I teach courses in global media at the 400 level, and one of the things we do in that class is compare different media systems globally. And depending on the government and depending on the government and the country's history, there are vastly different media systems globally with different priorities, different underlying goals. Some are more propagandistic and some prop up governments. Others are considered to be serving more watchdog functions in terms of what's going on politically. So one of the things hopefully you'll begin to understand in reading this chapter and consequent chapters as we move into the discussion of individual media or media platforms is that different politics dictate different kinds of systems. Different media also differentiate different kinds of social messages. I think it's safe to say, and we all recognize, that China, which largely operates with a highly governmentally controlled media system, has a particular goal for its media. And the media messages that come from the major Chinese television networks are designed to reinforce the status quo. We might think that in our own country that our largely advertising revenue generation based models of broadcast network television don't have such social agendas. Well, in fact, they have different social agendas, maybe not quite so direct or intentional, but nonetheless powerful in terms of reinforcing things like the importance of acquiring material goods and services in society. So you're going to be introduced as well to some of the social messages and impact of the social aspects of becoming more and more media literate. And perhaps most important, you need to become increasingly aware of the ownership of media and how ownership directly or indirectly dictates the kind of media content that as a media producer you're able to produce, or as a media consumer that you're able to consume. And we would be remiss if we didn't also bring your attention to the fact that various media, for example, media in America, print, radio, television, web, are all regulated to one degree or the other by law, by commissions, by watchdog groups that are designed to protect the citizenry. And these vary depending on media and the nature of media. So you'll also become aware in this chapter of regulatory issues that dictate the kinds of media institutions that we have. Let's change to the next panel. Part of this chapter talks about paths to media literacy and introduces you to the notion that it's important to study a medium's history, and particularly certain parts of that history, in order to help us understand how that medium has come to be. Let's talk about, for example, magazines for a moment. When they started out, how they evolved, how they're paid for, how they're competing or dealing with the introduction of newer media over time, how they've continued to survive or have had to change in order to survive. So you're going to be introduced to this notion that histories tell us a great deal about where media have been, but also likely where they're to go. Okay, so you'll be introduced in this chapter to the constructs that sets you up for consequent chapters when we're looking at print or electronic media. And you'll be introduced to the ideas of why it's important to look at historical developments of media. It's also important to look at regulatory developments. Having taught this course for years and years and years, and having been a student of the media for years, decades even, it's my experience that very often governmental regulation or self-regulatory practices in the media, particularly in this country, often come along a little bit later. Usually there's a development, a major earthquake, if you will, in terms of a major medium's development, and it forces everybody to kind of like take stock of where things are and decide what, if anything, we want to do in terms of helping to shape either the economic development of that industry or the content that's produced by that industry. You'll also be introduced to the study of sociological developments and how audiences, for example, have changed over time. The whole idea that increasingly we are no longer talking about major mass media in terms of mass audiences. In fact, it's one of the major issues that you'll be introduced to, the idea that audiences, because of a number of factors, have become increasingly fragmented. And some of that's a function of the next development that you'll study, and that's technological development. Inventors are constantly reinventing the media wheel. And as they do, they throw into turmoil, all right, the old ways of doing things. And tied in with that is the last path, if you will, to a media literacy that looks at history, and that's at the economic models. Because we still operate in a world often, particularly in Western civilization, the United States, for example, where if we can't pay for it through things like advertising or subscription, then very likely we are not going to see certain kinds of media or certain kinds of media content. So history, regulatory, sociological, technological, and economic developments are important things to keep in your pockets as you move forward and develop media literacy skills. You're also going to be introduced, and I've touched base on this a little bit already. Each medium is different. When we don't encourage students today to become media literate and skilled in only one media platform, and that requires that students in our program understand that when they're writing for print, if it's a magazine or newspaper, that's going to be different than if they're writing for the web version of a newspaper or the web version of a magazine, or if they're creating web exclusive text content. So how we frame words, how we use language, how we think about space on a piece of paper or on a page are all considerations that come into play when thinking about some of the grammars, if you will, the rules for expressing ourselves in print media. Some of that translates over into, for example, working in the audio industry or working in radio. Some of it doesn't. There are different grammars or rules for expression. This gets all jumbled up when we begin to think about visual media. And for some of us who teach advanced courses in how to do things in various media areas, for example, I teach advertising copywriting often at the 400 level. My students in that class learned that the same campaign translates messages very differently when they're working in print, electronic, audio, radio, outdoor, billboard, so on and so forth. So television has its own exclusive and important set of grammars for how we tell stories visually, with corresponding audio components. The same is true for filmic media. And of course, there's this entire emergent area of media, social media, that dictates entirely different rules and timing and pulsing in order to become effective. So say you're interested in becoming an expert in this program in advertising and public relations, or what we would call today integrated marketing communication. And a skilled IMC person is able to launch a campaign for a product or service or person or political campaign and do it equally well and maximize effectiveness across all of these media platforms we've discussed. And do so, all right, shifting easily back and forth because there's this innate understanding of how to communicate within each of those realms. Finally, you're going to be exposed in this chapter to the important commercial factors that dictate the bottom line. Never forget that if you can't get it paid for, you're very likely not going to be in that aspect of the business for very long. That's true for anything. It's also extremely true when we're talking about working in the media. You're going to be exposed to the idea that traditional media are really hurting because they're still locked into this notion of mass audiences and mass advertising. And you're going to read in various chapters that follow about how some of these traditional media industries are really in decline because advertisers are moving away and considering alternative ways to target audiences. And correspondingly, very few people have locked onto an ideal model for ways to generate revenue in emerging media. That's one of the great challenges of our time, figuring out ways to have people pay for newspaper content or news content when they no longer consider newspapers or broadcast news shows or even electronic websites containing news to be viable avenues or are not willing to pay for it. So those are some of the issues that we're going to be exposed to and think about in this chapter. Next chapter, we begin to look at print and move more and more into specific cases involving that medium. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back at you next week with Chapter 3 content.